If what you say is true, of course, it's very profound, because it means that right at the heart of something as important as education is at least a misunderstanding, at worst a rewriting of history to serve modern purposes and the modern narrative, not to elucidate information and understanding.
Well, absolutely, and this is because the word secular has itself, in a sense, been secularized, particularly over the last 60 years. I mean, even up until 1960, in the Ramsay Report on Education in Victoria, one of the stated purposes of education in Victoria was to teach children about the Christian heritage of their country and to teach them Christian morality. Now, that's 1960 in Victoria. So the words, and that was considered a secular system. And so the word secular has most certainly changed since then. And one of the projects of this book was to try to understand why the word secular has changed. And essentially the word secular has changed its meaning from meaning a way of thinking and an education system and even a government that is very hospitable to Christianity, to an education system that to a large extent seeks to exclude Christianity, and even to a political system that doesn't allow religion to have any influence in the laws. That tends to be what we mean by secular today. Now, in the 19th century, the idea that religious morality wouldn't have any influence in politics or the laws, that was a ridiculous idea, because that was essentially the same as saying that there'd be no morality in politics. So what has changed is essentially our view of Christianity. Because our view of Christianity has changed over the last 60 years, our understanding of the extent to which a secular order can accommodate Christianity has radically changed. But since the 1950s, and especially since the 1960s, social morality has changed. And I dare say, John, you've lived through these changes. You lived through the later 60s, you lived through the 1970s, where you saw popular attitudes to things like the family, gender, sexuality change quite radically, particularly in the 1960s. And so, especially probably after the availability of highly effective and easily accessible contraception in the early 1960s, all around the Western world for the most part, our sexual practices have greatly changed. And so, with the introduction of contraception, of very effective contraception. I mean, contraception's been around since the ancient world. John Stuart Mill was thrown in prison for handing out tracts on contraception when he was 17 years old, and that was in the early 19th century. Contraception's been around for a long time. What changes in the 1960s is that contraception becomes incredibly effective. And what that means is suddenly the question of why do I need to save sex for marriage actually becomes a question worth asking, because prior to effective contraception, keeping sex within marriage was not just a sort of a religious idea, it was just common sense, because everyone knew that if you go around having sex, you're probably at some point going to make a baby. And you need to be able to support that baby. And historically, we have an institution that is designed to support children, and that is marriage. Marriage was understood as a natural institution grounded in the fact that we are sexual beings, and the biological outworking of that fact is that we create other human beings. And that was sort of the main point of marriage, to manage that. But when you separate sexual activity from its pro-life inevitabilities, then the question then arises, well, why keep the old sexual morality? Why can't we have multiple sexual partners? Why do we have to wait until marriage to have sex? And so, especially with the availability of contraception, sexual mores start to change. And when that starts to change, other ideas about sexuality start to change as well. So if we're going to get rid of monogamy and the idea of sex only before marriage, well, what about other taboos? So what about, for example, homosexuality? Perhaps that's something that we're a bit behind the times on now as well. And so the sexual revolution of the 1960s changes the way we think about sexuality, sexual ethics, and what it does is that it brings popular understandings of sexuality and sexual ethics on a path away from traditional Christianity, to the point where if people nowadays say that you should save sex for marriage, or the only valid form of sexual expression is within heterosexual marriage, you are now not even any longer seen as sort of overly moralistic. You're actually seen as quite immoral. That public morality has so shifted away from traditional Christianity on those issues that traditional Christianity is actually seen as detrimental to people's mental health and actually detrimental to a healthy lifestyle. And what that means is that if the idea of secular education and the idea of a secular state is all about securing people's happiness and well-being in this life, then Christianity, because it is no longer considered particularly moral, at least in its teachings now on gender, say transgenderism is another issue, and sexuality, then Christianity cannot have any influence in the secular sphere. Certainly it shouldn't have any influence in education, and it shouldn't have any influence in politics. And so the word secular has gone from meaning very capacious and open to the influence of Christianity to meaning a sphere in which Christianity is either just barely tolerated or deemed to be a threat, because our understanding of Christianity has so shifted, because our understanding of morality has shifted and our understanding of what it is to be living a healthy life has shifted. And that's kind of where we are today.
You know, it does strike me that Christianity is blamed for a very great deal in our culture, and still is. There seems to be an idea in a lot of circles that it's still this terrible leftover of Christianity that's crippling our happiness and what have you. I remember the slogan that was all over London buses back when Dawkins first became prominent, that read, don't worry about God, he's probably not there, so go and have a good time.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, well, we've actually behaved as though he's not there now for decades,
yeah,
but we're not having a good time. And I would simply cite the raw data on that. We seem to be more anxious, more depressed, there's more self-harm, we're more tribalised, we're more divided, we're less trustful, to the point where our culture is falling apart. I think these are very, very challenging issues, I have to say.
Well, the irony of all of this, John, is that maybe these problems have never been worse, at least in recorded memory. But at the same time, here's the irony, John, that Christianity has never been socially weaker, and yet at the same time, it's never been more socially held accountable.
Did you enjoy this episode? We cannot get good public policy out of a bad debate. If you value vital conversations like this one, please like, share, subscribe, and join the conversation.